All right, so good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's a really pleasure to have you and also such a diverse group of colleagues, partners, practitioners joining us really from across the continent and beyond. So greetings to you all. Good afternoon, good morning, and thanks once again for joining. My name is Beatrice Makwenda from Trust Africa, and I'll be your host for this first session of the many Africa for Resilience learning series that we are all going to hold together going forward. So this is a series not just about presentations for their own sake, but it is about making sense where we are after COP30 in Belém, Brazil. And more importantly, is to say the outcomes from there, what it means for our work, our institutions, and our communities where we are all serving. Over the coming months, as Africa for Resilience Collective, we'll hear more about this collective. We would want really to spur and spark conversations, the global conversations that from COP30 and the many other global conversations that are taking place around issues on climate and development in general, to then bring it home to national realities and ultimately to really say what are locally led solutions that should be driving our conversations, our policy making, but also at practice level. And totally, this is where we will begin from today to really shaping this. So to begin with, we would have a few housekeeping issues with us to really just so that we can have an engaging session. One would request that your microphones are muted. And then let's make use of the chat. First of all, we know we are all joining from different corners of this globe on the continent. To really just introduce yourself. You can put your name, the institution, and even your contacts, and maybe just to let us know also where you're joining from. And then you feel free to use the question and answer functionality for any questions that you may have or comments that you'd like to engage in as we go on with this conversation. And if indeed, if time permits, and we'll try to do that, you can then raise your hands if you will need to ask a question or to make a comment, and then we'll be able to recognize you. But yeah, this is really to say this is an open space for us to share, and there is no one single person that has got a monopoly of ideas. Yeah, so that's how we'll move for today, and then we can move on with on the agenda. So this is an hour and roughly 30 minutes conversation that we are going to have. We'll have open remarks from Dr. Ibrahim Sal, and then we'll have a panel discussion of quite eminent people with us. Who this panel discussion will be moderated by Wall from Africa Climate Foundation, and then we'll open it up for question and answer and any comments for really engaging. So please keep yourself abreast with the conversation. We would want this really to be flowing from me, and then we'll tie it in together because, like I said in the beginning, this is the first of the many conversations that we would like to be having to say then from here, what next are we going to have? So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Ibrahim Sal, who is the Executive Director of Trust Africa. As you know, Dr. Ibrahim Sal is a long-standing thought leader on the African continent, really, as far as development governance is concerned, but also on the role of institution in shaping equitable futures. He has consistently challenged us to think beyond frameworks, but also to focus on agency, ownership, and what it truly means for Africa to define its own pathways. Today, he's going to give us this opening remarks on the verge of the very first Africa for Resilience Collective webinar and learning agenda, to really just say what is this that we need to be considering as we move forward. What is really at stake? What does it really matter for us to focus on resilience and adaptation on the continent, but also the intersection that we are seeing. So, Dr. Ibrima Sir, over to you. And let's give a big clap to Dr. Ibrima as he delivers his opening remarks. Over to you, Dr. Slao.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Beatrice. Thanks, Marilyn, also. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good morning, wherever you're speaking from. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, colleagues, friends, and partners. On behalf of Trust Africa, it gives a really great pleasure to warmly welcome you to this Africa for Resilience Learning Agenda webinar. It's a pleasure to see colleagues from across the continent joining us in what we hope will become an important space for reflection, learning, and collaboration. But before going any further, let me recognize and salute our partners, the collective founding members, Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, through Climate Justice Impact Fund for Africa, Africa Climate Foundation, Tax Justice Network Africa, Least Developed Countries Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience, hosted at the IED. Also, the Werecraft, my apologies for the pronunciation, Werecraft Foundation, and Celine, who has been instrumental in connecting the current members. I also want to recognize the representatives of the Climate Works Foundation and the Quadrature Climate Foundation. And everyone else, of course, for taking the time to join us in this webinar and for contributing to the immense work and of great importance to build a resilient Africa. And obviously, many thanks to the panelists, Kultum Omari, Eugene Fongwa, and Edwin Obero, who will be making initial presentations in this webinar. Now, this convening comes at a very critical moment. Across Africa, communities are already facing the lived realities of climate change, with the floods and droughts, displacement, growing economic vulnerabilities. So actually, those who contribute the least to global emissions are bearing some of the heaviest impacts. This we knew, but it's been demonstrated in every kind of way and every day. This is why the call for climate justice is not abstract for us in Africa. It is urgent, practical, and deeply rooted in the lived experiences of African communities. Across Africa, advancing justice and equity on the continent is central to our mission. Our work has long focused on strengthening African agency, supporting locally grounded institutions, and ensuring that African voices shape the policies and systems that affect our futures. Climate justice is therefore a natural extension of this commitment, ensuring that climate responses are not only technically sound, but also equitable, locally led, and transformative. It is in this spirit that the Africa for Resilience Collective has come into being. The Africa for Resilience Collective reflects a simple but very powerful idea, and that is no single institution can deliver the scale of transformation required to address the climate crisis in Africa. We need collaborative platforms that bring together African institutions, knowledge, and leadership to build resilient systems from the ground up, of course, with the support of Friends of Africa as well. What makes this collective particularly unique is its focus on African regranting organizations. Regrantors play a very critical role in the climate ecosystem. They act as bridges between global resources and local realities, ensuring that funding, knowledge, and support reach grassroots actors and frontline communities that are often excluded from traditional climate finance mechanisms. Through this collective, we are working to strengthen that ecosystem, by connecting African regrantors, amplifying learning, mobilizing resources, and advancing a shared climate justice agenda grounded in locally led adaptation and resilience. As interim lead of the Africa for Resilience Collective, Trust Africa sees its role not as directing the process, but rather as helping convene, catalyze, and support a truly collaborative platform. The strength of this initiative lies in its diversity and in the rounded leadership emerging from across African institutions, each bringing different kinds of expertise, regional perspectives, and networks. This webinar is part of that journey. It is the beginning of the journey, actually. The Africa for Resilience Learning Agenda aims to create a space where we can collectively explore what works, what needs to change, and how African institutions can shape more equitable and effective climate adaptation systems. Our discussions today and in the series that will follow are intended to deepen our collective thinking, strengthen partnerships, and ultimately contribute to a stronger African voice in the global climate justice landscape. So I'd like to thank all the organizations that are part of this emerging collective, as well as the partners and potential supporters who are joining us today to learn more about this initiative and to participate in the collective reflection. Your engagement signals that the moment for African-led collaboration on climate resilience and climate justice is not only necessary, but possible, and it is now. The moment is now. With that, I would like once again to welcome everyone to this session and wish us all a very productive and inspiring conversation. And once again, thank the panelists for leading the conversation that we are going to have now. Thank you for your kind attention. Over to you, Beatrice.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrima, for that. And speaking of a journey, since this is the beginning, I think we all know what we say, that if you want to go far, you don't walk alone, you have to walk with us. And this is the mantle that we are going with in this collective. So thank you for reminding us that our strength lies in numbers, and the numbers is what this collective is going to do it, to just rely on. And beyond that, it's our collective resolve to not just shape the narrative, but to define it both in policy, in governance, as well as in practice. So now I think it's the core is upon on each one of us, and then we will, as we move towards to really listening to some of these on just transition, on the global goal on adaptation, but also to see what then does this mean. I will then hand it over and invite Wally from Africa Climate Foundation, who is going to direct us on this panel, but also introduce the panel with us. Once again, thank you, Ibrima, and thank you all for joining. Let's keep engaging and use the question and answer functionality on this call. If you've got any ideas or questions that are already coming up from the welcome remarks, or any thoughts that you're having on today's conversation. Over to you, Wally.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Good afternoon once again, everyone. Good morning or good evening, wherever you're joining in from. I'm Wale Amon from the African Climate Foundation, and it is a pleasure to moderate this panel session. Just to let you know that this panel is specifically focusing on unpacking the outcomes of COP30 and what it means for the African continent. But before we dive into the discussion, please allow me to introduce our esteemed speakers. Firstly, we have Koutomo Mari, who is the lead coordinator for the Africa Group of Negotiators on Adaptation and the Global Goal for Adaptation. She's also a special advisor of the Africa Adaptation Initiative. Secondly, we have Eugene. Eugene Ofongwa is a public policy analyst specializing in climate, energy, and development policy. He also serves as the thematic lead for just transitions and energy access at PAPCHA. The last but not the least is Edwin Obiero, who is an experienced climate finance advisor who has worked with private sector and state actors and is also the head of delivery at Life AR. Before we move into the facilitated questions, I would like to give the next 7 to 8 minutes for each speaker to sort of share their own perspectives on the outcomes related to global goal on adaptation, just transition, and adaptation finance, what they took away from COP, and what they would like to see in the build-up to not just COP31, but COP32, and also how we drive collective action. So I would like to pass it to Kultum. Kultum, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Ole.
Thank you for joining once again. So I'd just like you to share your takeaways on the topic of the global goal for adaptation, the discussion in Belém, and what you think are the gray areas and areas to focus on for operationalization, and the role of both state and non-state actors in how we can use the GGA indicators to track our progress in advancing adaptation efforts on the continent. Over to you.
Thank you, Wale. And once again, thank you for the invitation to be part of this discussion, which is really much needed, particularly for our continent. And I think I must say that I've been invited to a few meetings, and I don't really think that we've had an Africa-wide sort of discussion in terms of after COP30 to really unpack some of these, so what we actually came out with. So really commend you for bringing us all together to discuss this, and really looking forward to the discussions going forward. And thank you, Dr. Ibrahim Asal, for setting the scene for us. I think that was an important way to set the scene and to start the discussions. So I will try and speak in 7 minutes. Adaptation is a very big topic for Africa, so I will try my level best. And if I go over time, please just alert me, and I'll try and stop. So I don't think the GGA, the Global Goal on Adaptation, actually needs an introduction. I think what is important for me is this is something that was an Africa proposal, something that we wanted as Africa, and we wanted to see how the global process was going to help us assess progress, just like how we do that in mitigation, but we wanted to do that in adaptation so that we can understand where the gaps are, what the needs are, so that there can be an appropriate amount of support that comes in the context of means of implementation, which is finance, capacity building, and technology transfer to support those needs that developing countries have. And we've been trying to push this discussion for a very long time. It went very technical. For those of you who are following the negotiations, you will know that it became very technical. And then now it's we've concluded a big chunk of the technical work. So now it goes back to implementation, and then coming back in 2 years to really figure out where we are with the GGA. I would say I won't go into what happened in Belém. A lot of things happened if you were watching, but we did come up with a set of indicators, which as Africa, we were very clear that these indicators, at least the ones that we got from the experts that were given that task, were not fit for purpose. They were very prescriptive. They were picking on they were going bordering on our sovereignty, and some of it was really against the whole provisions of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, such as domestic budgets and so on and so forth. So there were quite a lot of challenges that we as Africa had with these indicators, and so we pushed back a lot, and we managed to get these 59 indicators adopted. I say adopted in quotes because there's some work that is required for us to do between now and the Africa COP, where we are going to what we call policy alignment. I mean, it's still a bit hazy what policy alignment is. It was our proposal, but it is something that we need to really figure out. So I won't go into the technical and the thematic sort of discussion around water, food security, health, all of that, cities and so on, in terms of the indicators that we got, because we really need to really unpack, and we're having a meeting in the next 2 weeks as Africa to figure out what these indicators mean. So I won't spend some time on that, because we are trying to really come to terms on what those indicators are, because we didn't negotiate them. They were given as a presidency proposal. But what I want to say is really around what the GGA can do for us, the potential that it has. So one is that we have managed, to the extent possible, to bring the discussion on means of implementation, which is finance, capacity building, and technology transfer, back into adaptation. I think, being an adaptation negotiator for a while, I saw that discussion around finance, capacity building, and technology transfer, we were really losing it. And I think the indicators have helped us bring that back, because if you look at the discussion, the decision rather, you will see that the decision has put Article 9.1, which is around provision of adaptation, finance for adaptation. Really, it's really there, and it's captured in there. The question becomes how we then now implement that or translate that. So articles referring to finance, such as 9.1, around developed country parties shall provide financial resources to assist developing country parties with respect to mitigation and adaptation, is in there, in the language. So it's about how we work with that language. There's also language around quality of finance, provision of finance, needs, and so on. These are the kinds of things that we've been pushing for. So there is room there to further the discussion on MOI. I'm going to say MOI, such that we are able to get, once we do all the reporting on these indicators, we are able to have a sense of what our needs is as developing countries, what finance has been provided in the form of grants and loans and so on and so forth, and are these meeting our needs? So on the MOI part, I would say that there is something to build on. I'm not 100% happy with the decision, but there is something that we can work with. And I think also looking at the decisions that also we agreed to in Dubai, which clearly state that the extent to which the GGA is implemented by developing countries depends on action at all levels and the effective implementation by developed country parties when it comes to MOI. So it makes it very clear that for us to actually implement these very ambitious targets and ambitious adaptation action, it really requires all the effort from developed countries, for sure, on means of implementation. That is not to say it's just only grants. Of course, that's our position and would like that, but it's just to say the recognition that we cannot agree on these very ambitious things on adaptation and targets without the necessary support, right? And that's great. The second thing that I think the GGA can do for us as Africa is it provides us with an opportunity to understand where the current data and knowledge gaps are, right? So we have been doing, as parties, we've been doing reporting on in our BTRs and so on, but this adaptation specific reporting and adaptation support reporting has really been a challenge for us, and we've not been able to do that. Also because it hasn't really been required within the UNFCCC. But now that it is required, when we start doing that, we'll be able to understand what kind of knowledge gaps we actually have, what kind of finance gaps we have, what kind of technology needs we have, and all of the capacity needs we have, because we'll be able to be reporting on all of these elements. And it gives us a better sense of our understanding, so that when all this information goes back into the UNFCCC through the GST can then say, okay, we know that there's these things that are missing to support developing countries. These elements are missing for finance. These elements are missing for capacity and technology transfer. So we are going to be building our data systems, our knowledge systems, because then we'll see that the information is not sufficient, and we can then develop that at the national level. So yeah, so that's the other thing. Sorry, I'm trying to see. I can't see where my. Just give me a second. Yeah, I've got two screens on and they're just confusing me here. And then when we start also to provide this information in the reporting of the GGA based on what we've agreed in Belém, we also start to see what kind of capacity is needed at our national level. For example, capacity to develop project proposals, capacity for providing climate information services, and capacity for modeling, and all of that, and all of that which is really lacking in our context. So the GGA will help us to unpack that, because we will be required to provide that kind of information. And then information on access of finance, quality of finance, provision of finance is extremely important. So when we start reporting on that kind of information, we'll begin to see that indeed we are providing information. We are actually receiving a lot of finance that is actually loans, and that can be burdensome to many developing countries and poorer countries in particular, where we already have fiscal constraints and additional loans and so on will not be sufficient. So once we start talking about the quality, not just the quantity, but the quality of finance and who is providing this finance, then all of that will really be unpacked, and the GGA will help us. So all this information, and I want to wrap up, all this information is important, and it can help us clarify also how international public adaptation finance flows can be scaled up because of the needs that we've identified, the barriers that we've identified. And this can inform the revisions to current approaches that we have right now, but also feed into the assessments under the global stocktake process, because all of this is connected. And I know that others are going to speak about some of the other elements, but, and I have a big but here, but if it doesn't do that, if it doesn't provide that kind of information to trigger these scaled up financial resources and so on, then it just remains a reporting tool. The reporting that we do currently, and a transparency tool, which doesn't really lead to action, and this just becomes a really burdensome process, because, as you know, many of our countries, we don't have sufficient capacity to be doing this reporting. We don't want to be doing reporting for no reason. We want to be doing reporting because it will actually lead to more action and also more resources that will be flowing. So if it doesn't do that, and this remains to be seen, so that's why I said I'm not 100% convinced. The idea is great. Everything that we've got is something that we can build upon. But if it doesn't lead to action, and if it doesn't lead to scaled up financial resources and resources for capacity building and technology transfer, then it would be that would not be a good use of our time, honestly. So I will stop here, and I'll be here for any other questions that we have. Thank you very much, and I hope I haven't taken too much of your time.
Thank you so much, Gultum, for sharing your perspectives, for letting us see that there's still work to be done under the Belém vision, and our African countries can further champion how the indicators are linked to the means of implementation, and how we can also leverage this opportunity to improve our knowledge and data system. So thank you so much for capturing that. I will now welcome Eugene to the stage. Eugene, can you hear me? I would like you to share your own perspectives on just transitions and what it means for the African continent, and how we should continue shaping this narrative as a development priority. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wale, and thanks to the previous speakers for setting the scene so beautifully. Allow me to start by saying that I may not, repeat all of the decisions or non-decisions that were taken around the just transition issue in Belém, but I'm usually more interested in looking at the trends and seeing the direction of things and asking myself, how do we recalibrate so that we are not left behind? Nonetheless, let me start by grounding my thoughts in the Just Transition Work Program that emerged from COP30, because I think that will give us an important entry point, but it will also reveal some of the gaps that we still need to address. The work program did a number of things. One of them was that it did recognize critical elements that are important to Africa, particularly the emphasis on workers and communities and the link to sustainable development. It also gave us a sense that there was greater recognition and an important shift happening towards acknowledging that transition processes must be socially inclusive and development oriented. Nonetheless, the challenge is that much of the framing still reflects economies that are managing transitions. What I mean is these are economies whose starting point is heavy fossil, heavy carbon dependence, rather than those that are building systems from the ground like the continent. And so that's a problem for us as a continent. And that quickly leads us to then ask the question, in that context, how can African countries design just transition strategies that respond to their own local economic realities? The starting point for me is to recognize, as I've just mentioned, that Africa is not transitioning from a high carbon economy. It is transitioning from a low carbon economy, but also from energy poverty. And this, to me, is still missed in global discussions on the just transition. That distinction matters because it also fundamentally changes what we mean by just. Because the transition, there really isn't a debate that some kind of transition has to happen. The real debate is around what it is just. And this is not usually a very shared understanding. There's usually not a very shared understanding of what just represents and just for who and just in what sense. So by reframing the just transition conversation on the continent, it can help us to begin having a sense of what a just transition would look like for the continent. And I say this because the risk is that global just transition narratives, if we are not adapting them to the context of the Africa, could unintentionally become instruments of injustice in Africa by constraining development pathways without providing viable alternatives. So for African countries, the key challenge is not how to exit fossil fuels or avoid fossil-intensive pathways of industrialized countries. I'm going to take a break here. It's a little controversial what I've just said. I'm not saying that's not something that needs to happen. I'm saying it shouldn't be a priority. The simple explanation is that the continent accounts for only 4% of global emissions. So the key challenge, in my view, and this is in terms of the work that we have been doing to try to change the framing of the challenge, is how to build inclusive, resilient economies while expanding energy access to 630 million people still without electricity. This shift is significant because it begins to tell us at a very early stage what just outcomes from the transition would look like for the continent. And I think that to be able to achieve something close to a just outcome in the transition journey for the continent, there are three things that need to happen. The first is that the transition must protect and upgrade existing livelihoods. Millions of Africans depend on sectors like agriculture, informal energy, artisanal mining. The goal should not be to replace these overnight, which is, again, the narrative. The emphasis on new green jobs underestimates the disruptions that would be caused across sectors of the continent. We can't replace those overnight, but to make them more productive, more efficient, and less vulnerable to climate risk. So we need to start by protecting the little livelihoods that we have on the continent before we add the new jobs. It's not a question of replacing jobs. Secondly, countries need to anchor their transition in productive sectors. So that could take the form of expanding renewable energy, but ensuring that that energy is able to power jobs through agro-processing, small industries, local value chains. And without that link, we risk energy access without economic transformation. Again, this speaks a little bit to what we hear. The discussion is usually about installed capacity, increase installed capacity, double, triple renewable energy. But we know that the problem is not installed capacity. There are other structural problems that limit access. And so we must focus on the last mile communities and ensuring that the transition becomes a driver for that productive energy access at local levels, way beyond the ability to charge cell phones and light up homes in the evening. The third is that Africa must capture value from the transition. This means moving beyond exporting raw materials to building domestic industries and processing in manufacturing and in skills. And again, this is an area where we are really concerned, especially in the current geopolitical context, where the interest of industrialized countries is the protection of supply chain, supply routes, and securing supplies rather than helping African countries to draw benefits from the resources that they have under their soils. The ongoing geopolitical crisis in the Middle East tied to oil and gas tells us again that while as a continent we're hoping that we're trying to save the climate regime, the national security and strategic interests of industrialized countries is actually what drives their actions, not an ambition to save the climate regime. And we've seen over and over that once those fundamental strategic and security interests are threatened, there's a tendency to retreat from trying to advance the climate agenda. And we've seen that over and over with the United States, but increasingly with other countries in Europe and other parts of the industrialized world. So Africa needs to be able to get to a point where it's able to capture value from the transition, but also become a rule maker for the transition rather than a recipient of the direction of the transition. Otherwise, the transition will reproduce the existing inequalities. I've often argued with people that we really have to realize that the level of under-industrialization on the continent had nothing to do with fossil fuels. Other countries were able to use fossil fuels to industrialize. Africa had fossil fuels, didn't industrialize. Therefore, the problem is really not the resource itself, but the capacity of African countries to draw value from the resource. And so otherwise, the whole idea that Africa has the highest potential in renewable energy resources, solar irrigation, etc., doesn't make a lot of sense if that doesn't translate into value for the continent. And finally, none of this will happen without a shift in finance and technology. We know that current flows are too fragmented and too risk averse. What African countries need is long-term. If we're going to have challenges with getting grants, at least long-term concessional finance and genuine technology transfer that builds domestic capacity. So in my opinion, and I'm going to close with this, the real test of a just transition in Africa should be asking whether it creates jobs, it expands energy access, it drives industrialization, it strengthens local economies, it boosts development. Because in my view, the transition for Africa is a transition into prosperity and not a transition away from fossil fuels, because in any case, we're only accounting for 4% of global emissions. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop here and I can come back if there are other issues that emerge. Wole?
Thank you so much, Eugene, for capturing that excellently, for highlighting sort of the three buckets where you see how Africa's transition outcomes should be framed. Firstly, around protecting and upgrading existing livelihoods. The second is capturing value from this transition and also moving towards being a strategic decision maker and also anchoring this on productive sectors. You also started highlighting points on finance, which is a perfect segue for Edwin to come in and share his perspectives on the call for us to triple adaptation finance by 2035. What does this mean for developed countries? What does it mean for the current financial global financial architecture? And what should African countries be doing to close this current gap? Over to you, Edwin.
Thanks, Wole. I'd like to start by saying coming last often has its advantages and its disadvantages because a number of things have been raised by some of the speakers. So I'll try to, but the full advantages, I can re-emphasize some of those points. And I want to start off by, I had prepared some slides so that we can be a bit engaging with our participants joining us online. So if those slides could be shown, I'd really appreciate it. And I want to start off from Dr. Ibrima's, if you like, opening remarks. And two things that I picked up from that is that the problem that we are facing is so big that no one organization, no single organization can do this by themselves. We need collaboration. We need a collaborative approach. And that is the entry point to sort of introduce who LifeAR is, so that I build on to that. It stands for the LDC Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience. It's an LDC-led initiative in the next slide. It's an LDC-led initiative, led in the sense that it was designed by the LDCs themselves. The chair, the governance structure is within the LDC group. So the chair of the LDC group is the same chair for the initiative, and it's one of the 4 flagship initiatives that aims to address the LDC needs. So both LifeAR and 2 other initiatives, one on renewable energy and another one on bringing together a consortium of universities, come together to address this long-term LDC vision of putting all LDC countries into a climate resilient development pathway, but also within a longer term horizon, so the midterm 2030 and a longer time horizon of making sure that delivery of net zero emissions happen. There's three impact areas in which each of these initiatives sort of contribute to, which I will not dig into. But I want to just give a bit of a geographic footprint in the next slide, just to give you an idea on where we are, where the initiative is, who are the partners. So the initiative, LifeAR adopts this concept of partnership. It's a partnership-based approach to tackling some of the biggest challenges that we are facing, and the framing is perfect. Climate catastrophes are mostly a lived reality for LDCs. So it's not a risk that could happen in the future. It's something that's happening now. And so the idea is that both LDC countries that that are signing up to this, joint effort of tackling this challenge can come together with development partners. And you can see in the slide the geographical scope, but you can also see that it's a compact agreement that's signed between both developed countries and if you like, development partners and LDCs to sort of tackle this together, not in the usual sense of financial contribution, but it goes way beyond that to collaborating on finding strategies, sharing knowledge, and sharing strategies of tackling climate, because climate change it has both the mid-term and the longer term perspectives and planning that is required. So I wouldn't get into the next in the next slide. I wanted to show how the initiative works. I will not dive into that, but we can share some of this in the chat so that conversation can flow later. But I want to tackle one of the main reasons why the initiative does exist, and which is a segue into why climate finance, particularly for adaptation, is a problem. In the next slide, we talk about what are the problems that we see. The previous slide, please. What are the main problems that we see with the traditional climate responses? So it's not shown here, no worries. It's okay, I'll speak to them. There's three main areas. One is the impact is externally driven. It's fragmented. It's not delivered. It's not delivering impact to LDCs. It's not inclusive. So some of these things have been discussed by the previous, if you like, presenters. But I think the fundamental one is that decision making is not being taken by those who are mostly responsible in facing the challenges of climate. So that failure of trying to build and I have 5 minutes left now. That failure of trying to build these systems, living institutional capabilities, is fundamental. And so the scale of the challenge, what is the problem what is the problem in terms of financial, in terms of money that we are facing? And these are some numbers. I like normally presenting numbers so that I don't misrepresent them. And UNEP did a publication just before the COP session that sort of tried to outline what the problem was. So I wouldn't delve deep into it. The first slide, the first figure that you see is the current status, where we are now, the amount of money that is currently being allocated for adaptation finance, and this is only public money, so this doesn't include private finance. What is required is 310 to 365 billion is needed by 2035. At Glasgow, there was this requirement, sort of this compact, to sort of double the adaptation funding required to 40 billion relative to existing at that time in 2019, that was around 20. And that is ending in 2025. So the report itself says that it's likely that the Glasgow Compact is likely not to be met. One of the biggest things, I think, one of the biggest outcomes that we got from Belém was that the agreement to triple adaptation finance to 120 billion by 2025 was welcome. There was a little bit of a problem with it because LDCs, within this 120 billion, it's nestled into the NCQG, so it's a journey. All this thing is a continuum that had been agreed. So NCQGs had been agreed earlier on in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, and so it means that it blends both public and private sources. Already, it's very problematic, as the initial speaker had mentioned, that LDCs are facing challenges with debt. So it's going to be very complicated for them to raise funding. So the idea that two problems: one, the pledge currently we haven't met the Glasgow, the Glasgow commitment. Number two, now we have a big, if you like, commitment to sort of try to triple the amount that's available. And number three is that it's nestled within the broader framework of not just using public finance, but also private finance. So it gives the impression that the commitment, we are losing that commitment. So that's the challenge on quantity, the amount. Now, the other part around it, which is quality, the predictability of finance, because when you're talking about planning for climate, the existing climate risks and the future climate risks, you need to plan and project how much resources would be available to address either for capacity strength, capability strengthening, for planning, for managing the risks that you have not just now, but also in the future. That's very difficult to do if this vision, if this idea is not very clear. So there's a bit of data there that I have provided, that we are providing on the amount of money that's reaching LDCs. That's been tracked, so it's very, very little. So that compounds the problem already. The amount is very little, but the quality, how much it flows from the national to from the international to the national to the local level, you find that if 18% of the global amount reach LDC, only 10% of what's received reach the local level. So there's a really big problem because that is where the needs are. Problems aside, in the next slide, we want to share some examples of what could be done. And it's classed into 4 categories. The first one is to really try to find equitable partnerships with funders not just providing capital. Capital is great, but I think there's a lot more value that funders could provide by creating linkages, learning sessions, championing for what's working and not working, so that we keep building and not become effective with the way that financing is deployed. Obviously, pooling of resources to diversify that delivery risk, including joint reporting frameworks. There was a conversation earlier on, so that we reduce the burden and the incremental costs. The second one is the approach to designing, implementation. I think it's time to really move away from projectized, single projectized kind of working, because that's really inefficient. So reflect on how to go towards more programmatic designs, medium to long-term programming, so that adaptive management becomes a reality. The third is on country and community ownership. I think that is very, that's been discussed at length by the previous presenter, so I will not deliberate the point. But the last one that I want to also highlight is funders and countries, and maybe implementing partners, implementing entities as well in country. This idea of devolved decision making to where it's really required is very crucial. That agency, that decision-making process, either to communities, but also to local governments, it's really crucial so that we don't come up with ideas that are top-down, which we know have not worked quite well. I'm going to stop here and, back to you, Wally. Happy to take any questions as part of the conversation. Over.
Thank you so much, Eugene, for the presentation and also linking it to the challenge of both the quantity of finance and the quality. And I'm keen to come back to you, but wanted to open the floor for questions. Feel free to use the Q&A section to put in your questions for the panelists, and we will take them. I'll quickly pass it over to Edwin just in 2 minutes to quickly share in your perspective, given the current framework we have in the financial world and in an era of geopolitical fragmentation and this change in risk. How can African countries really navigate this to be able to still deliver finance to where it's needed the most?
Thanks so much, Wale. I think what I just presented could have, how many minutes have I got? just to manage that, 2 minutes. Okay. I think we run the risk of imagining that we have nothing, that we are running on empty. I want to believe that we are running on near empty, so it's not empty yet. There's something, so we have something that we can build on, and I think it's a moment for us to really have collective action and not paralysis, where we're worried about what's going to happen next. So, a couple of things. I think a couple of messages. Funding has reduced, yes, but I think the climate impacts are worsening. So that is actually an impetus for us to even work a lot more harder. There is a challenge. I think the biggest challenge that we normally face is low accountability and transparency frameworks. Those do really deter funders. So how do we build capabilities into that to showcase that we are efficiently managing resources? Obviously, we have complex reporting requirements. If there is a way to harmonize all that, it could make life easier for almost everyone, the funders, the implementing entities. And I think the last thing, if we are talking climate, you cannot implement, if you like, initiatives that are trying to address climate, yet the analysis of climate risks are not integrated into it. So climate risk and vulnerability assessments, either at the national, regional, community level, those are fundamental. So 4 main things. Let's join the dots. Let's shift thinking to medium to longer term. Let's be intentional on how we are allocating the resources that we have. Within Life AR, we have this ambitious goal, for instance, that 70% of all resources that we have is destined towards, action on the ground, and countries are actually implementing that in their own way. That is an example. Maybe there are others. And I think building our collective capabilities, I think this is the time to really build our capabilities in all these things that we are discussing now. Over to you, Wole.
Thank you so much, Edwin, and that was right on time. For our audience, please feel free to use the Q&A segment to type in your questions, and we'll be happy to direct them to the relevant speakers. Eugene, I wanted to come back to you to build on some of the points you started around how we need to anchor this transition on productive sectors. So how can African countries realistically do this? And how do we still protect the informal sector, and also building on this to then create the next level of new jobs, especially for a young continent like Africa? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the starting point is as I said, we have to reframe the conversation. So it means that we're no longer talking about artisanal mining as something that needs to be displaced, but as something that needs to be strengthened and upgraded. That alone changes how we invest. But secondly, we don't need to separate the transition from our development. There was an interesting question we were discussing just a couple of days ago. What comes first for the continent? Should we have a development roadmap that aims to ensure that it produces climate goods? Or should we pursue climate change and hope that we develop through that? But just by repositioning what our priorities are can really shift the way we design and implement our policies and programs. So the real challenge for me at this point is no longer whether we know what we need to do, but it's how we are approaching what we need to do. How are we taking on board the specific circumstances of Africa to address? I did mention very briefly when I initially spoke about the need for greater African agency. We're not going to be able to succeed in this transition if Africa is not a rule maker. How do we leverage then the resources that we have to determine the pathways for the transition, if not for the rest of the world, at least for the continent? We are responding to an agenda that is set by a global community that is, to a very large extent, informed by the framing of the problem through an industrialized world's lens. So for us, we have to start right down there and redefine the problem and then build a new policy and program approaches once we have a clear understanding of what we want to do. So it's strategic interest versus collective interest. The African strategic interest versus the global collective interest. And we've seen that it's only Africa that for some reason believes that there is such a thing as global solidarity. The evidence tells us that there is no such thing as global solidarity when it comes to these issues. All of the disagreements we have at COPs and other negotiation rooms is because countries are projecting their national strategic interests into the global public space. And I think to some extent, African intellectuals and policymakers need to begin to define the strategic interests of the continent and see whether they can use that to sway the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eugene. That's perfectly captured. I can see we have a few questions in the Q&A. We'll come to them. I wanted to go back to Kulthum to just share what African countries should be doing within the short term or on the work on the global goal on adaptation, the indicators, and how we leverage the Bellemadis vision to help achieve this.
Thanks for that question. I think, to engage with the discussions that we've been having in the UNFCCC, it would be important because right now we've got these set of indicators that we've agreed to, and in as much as it was a political process, it was also a technical process. And so having our countries, African countries, really engaging with those indicators, there is a clause within the decision that we have to test the indicators, right? And I just want to urge, if this is something that we can say to African countries, if the ultimate goal is to enhance adaptation, action, and support, to get to a place where the global process, the UNFCCC process, actually understands why we need to support adaptation, is to actually show that we're being impacted, and this is what we are feeling in our countries. This is the kind of, like Eugene talked about development issues, because when you're busy dealing with adaptation, development priorities or development projects and so on will be falling behind, right? Because you're busy trying to deal with emergencies. You're busy trying to deal with where I come from in Botswana. We've had floods that we've not had in more than 15 years of this nature, and so we are constantly running after crisis after crisis after crisis, and so that comes at the cost of our development, right? And we need to demonstrate this. We need to show that this is what climate change is doing to us, that we are actually putting development of, educating our children and girls and boys, healthcare, all of that is falling significantly behind because we're busy trying to deal with the climate crisis. And the GGA affords us that opportunity to be able to say this. So we should not look at the GGA and the indicators as a very technical process. It's actually very, very, very political, because we are now bringing this justice lens, this equity discussion back to the table. And Eugene even referred to this when he talked about these issues as well. So and I think that's the pushback that we are getting when we go into the negotiations, that this is just, adaptation is very difficult, it's complex, we can't measure it, how are we going to measure resilience and so on. Yeah, of course, that kind of discussion is taking place, but in the academic world, the lived realities of Africans right now is, we are not able to develop as much as we want because we have to deal with these climate change, and we have to deal with adaptation all the time. We are confronted that we can't even develop our power stations and so on and so forth. So I think that's engaging with GGA and the indicators from that angle, so that you're able to provide the information to the global space to say, this is what we are feeling, this is what we have to deal with, this is what our needs are. I think will change the dynamics when we go into the negotiations, even though the quality testing of the indicators. And I think with that, we have this 2-year process. So going back to the negotiations, we have these 2 years to be able to do that until we go to Addis for the Belém Addis vision. And I think if in these 2 years we can be very serious and deliberate about doing all of these and being able to provide some empirical, and I'm using an academic word, but it really is about being able to provide this kind of information and data and so on, so that we're able to inform this process and inform the GST that is coming in 2028. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kotun, for sharing your reflections. We'll take a few questions from our audience. Firstly, it's a question on scaling bottom-up initiatives to ensure that they are adopted over a long time. I think this is a good question for Edwin, given the work with Life AR. How do we sort of firstly get more communities to advance their local actions, and how can such be aggregated in a way and scaled up for lasting impact? Over to you, Edwin.
Thanks a lot, Wale, and I think that's an excellent question. I think we need to recognize that we are not starting from zero. In most of the countries in which we operate in, there's some form of devolved either governance. There's a central government system, and then there's a devolved governance system that does exist. So the idea is not to start from scratch and come up with different parallel systems, but look at what is existing and then build off that. Look at what's working well, what can be built on, what's not working, because obviously there are things that will not work. If we approach it that way, then you get into a multi-tiered system. At the national level, you could have a whole, a government planning system that looks into long-term, medium-term, and development pathways, something of that sort. That's your NAPs, your NDCs, your long-term development plans. And then at the local level, they would typically have, say, 5-year annual planning system. So building onto that, I think, is the best way of, working through what is existing, and then you can scale it in through higher tiers. And there's a concept around country platforms or national platforms, as we call it. That is a great way of making sure that there is supervisory role provided at the highest level, but also technical, so that what's happening at the local level, we can inbuild accountability and transparency and all that over at that point. So this is to say that it's not something, it's not an idea that is new. It's an idea that has been there from before. There are challenges that it's facing, and we could improve on it to make sure that it works. And I think we have plenty of examples in the continent that we can show for that. But yeah, every context, I think what's important to note is it has to be contextualized. You can't bring something from, it's not one size fits all. That's the best recipe for disaster, if I can call it. Yeah, over.
Thank you so much, Edwin, for answering that. We have another question, and I will direct this to Eugene. It's on the question of more African unity and agency. And the question is that how can we move towards a unified approach to supporting ourselves, firstly, and also moving away from various bilateral agreements which don't really serve the benefit of the entire continent. For instance, the recent sort of health deals by the United States with different African countries. How do we move to a unified voice to deliver strategic outcomes that we want?
I don't think the direction is a unified voice, because we've always had a unified voice. Africa has gone into these negotiations with a common position for the last 20 years. But the real risk is what you have described, that we don't have a unified strategy. So I think the first thing is that we need to move from a common position to a common strategy. Otherwise, the bilateral arrangements that we're seeing would break the continent. But we also observe that we need to acknowledge the different situations of different countries. So the forest countries, for example, in the Congo Basin, face uniquely different challenges and aspirations from desert countries and so on and so forth. So I think that one of the challenges, how do we develop common strategies that integrate the diversity of the continent? Unfortunately, the African Union is not designed to tell African states anything. Quite not possible. Until there have been discussions about what kinds of reforms are needed at the level of the continental body, so that these kinds of common strategies. So we are engaging with the EU as the EU, not Nigeria with the EU, and Cameroon with the EU, and Ghana with the EU, and so on and so forth, but as Africa and the EU. But the African Union doesn't have that mandate to be able to negotiate. We've seen examples of the carbon, the trade adjustments that are being made. The EU doesn't have a mandate to do something similar, to retaliate, if you want to use that expression. It will come down to individual countries to respond to the collective effort of Europe as an individual country. So that a lot of those structural challenges that I think must first be addressed before we can. But again, I think there's opportunity for a shared vision for the continent, and the more we understand that the collective interest of the continent is important, and that when we stand together, what happens to one country can be much mitigated if the rest of the continent stands by them. Then we get to a point where these bilateral arrangements have less impact on the collective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eugene. And thank you everyone for joining. Fortunately, we are running out of time and would like to capture some reflections and practical action steps from our speakers. I want to start with Edwin. What should African organizations and institutions, from government to private to civil societies, be doing over the next 3 to 6 months in not just advancing the conversation, but also taking practical steps based on some of your earlier suggestions? And how can a collective such as Africa for Resilience advance those priorities?
Well, I think we've already started it, right? We've already started it by having this conversation. Normally, I like to think that when you stop learning, you start dying. There's that expression, and I like sharing it because it's very relevant to what we normally do. And the idea of staying siloed, I think the era of staying siloed, of doing a project and then you implement it and you finish and you share results, that era is gone. So I think partnerships will be crucial. Learning from what has happened and has not worked is important, so that you're building, because at the end of the day, I think everything that we are doing is for the communities, and it has to be community centered. So that would be my closing, perhaps, reflection on this. Over to you.
Thank you, Edwin. Eugene?
Thank you. There's been conversations on exactly what kinds of powers or influence should the Africa Group of Negotiators have. To what extent can they shape policies at national levels, and through their network of designated national authorities, how can governments be influenced to bypass this problem of the lack of a central point where policies can be generated for the whole of the continent? Can the Africa Group of Negotiators, so perhaps engaging the African Group of Negotiators and continuing to see how their role can be strengthened beyond sitting in those negotiation rooms and being overridden sometimes by their leaders could be a good way to go. The second thing is I did mention that the idea of a common strategy, not this time, not in terms of for the continent, but for civil society actors and for non-state actors and for other actors, could be very helpful in driving things beyond. There's so many people doing little bits of things with brilliant ideas, but these energies are dispersed. There's fragmentation. Of course, there's disagreement at some levels on positions, but if there were a common strategy and support, that can work. And the third thing I want to say is that we really need to work very hard on the evidence. We need to demonstrate that this is wild, it's happening. Only about 4% of the science that is used to design global climate policy comes from Africa, which means that the policies are informed by science knowledge that is not from the continent. And sometimes it's even what is referred to as African science is actually science on Africa, not really African science. So there is plenty of work that needs to be done in that area, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eugene, Edwin, and Kutum. I understand Kutum had to drop off for another engagement she had. Well, it was a pleasure getting your insights.
Sorry, just one thing. Negotiation priorities. I keep forgetting this. I think one of the weaknesses we've had as a continent is that we want to bite as much as we can. We focus on adaptation and climate finance for a couple of years, but we've still really not, even in that discussion on adaptation and climate finance, we've still not prioritized what is relevant for the continent. We just say adaptation is our priority, but we have not prioritized what about adaptation is important for the continent. So I think that a sharper focus on what produces the greatest impact for the continent could help move things forward, especially as we look forward to COP32, which some suspecting could be a turning point for the continent on adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eugene, for capturing that. We need to build more Africa-led evidence. We need to sharpen our negotiation priorities and leverage the momentum for the COP that is next year. And how we strengthen the AGN national level coordination is very important. And Edwin also highlighted the need for partnerships, which is why the Adaptation for Resilience Group is keen on working together to advance locally led action for adaptation on the continent. Thank you to our esteemed speakers for sharing your insights. We thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure our audience would have learned and also taken some action points from this. I will now hand over to Beatrice to continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wale. I think that was quite an insightful conversation on what we should be thinking about. And I would like to thank you all for sharing your insights, but also for quite some insightful questions and comments that have come from all the participants. So as we indicated at the start, this is the first of the many conversations that we intend to be having. And we welcome your ideas as well as maybe topical issues that you would like maybe the next webinar to focus on. You can quickly type in the chat now, or as we provide more insights and outcomes from this conversation, you can also share with us with some of the contact details that are being shared on the chat as well. But otherwise, I think as we come to a close of this session, let me briefly reflect on a few threads that really stand out. First, while COP30 has moved the conversation forward, and I think the just transition mechanism is one, the global goal on adaptation and its indicators is another, and the many other conversations that are moving forward, particularly on adaptation and finance. The real question is not necessarily as to what was agreed, but what then becomes actionable. Then secondly, we've heard, I think from our distinguished panel as well, that clearly that Africa cannot engage these processes passively, whether it's the global goal on adaptation, just transition, or financial flows in general. There is both an opportunity that we're seeing based on the data, the evidence, and the sharing that has come from the panel, but also a risk depending on how we position ourselves, especially on the continent at the nation level, but also at the communities. And thirdly, this actually both the opportunity and the risks and the glaring realities that we are seeing reinforces exactly why Africa for Resilience is coming into being or is existing. Because one, as a space to connect these global shifts to local realities, but also to really strengthen how African institutions can engage, influence, and deliver collectively beyond ourselves, beyond in our own institutions, but then bringing it all together to say that we not just shape the voice, but also we take charge on strategy that influences what eventually happens at community level. So this being just the beginning of the conversation, and as we look ahead to our next session, we will then move from these global conversations to the national, focusing on how countries and communities are actually building resilience, what is out there, some of the insights that came from Lafayette examples, what resources and systems are enabling resilience building or transition, or constraining that at local level. So we would move towards that, and we would invite you to really be part of this conversation and come on and join, either to influence what our next session should look like, but also become part of the collective. Like we said, this is an open invitation for all of us to share our ideas, share our knowledge, so that together we build a bushfire that owns the narrative and move mountains in terms of what AU is also thinking about. And if there is no hope in global solidarity, can we therefore then build African solidarity? So as me, your host on this very first one, together with Africa Climate Foundation, Pan-African Climate Justice Network, Justice Network Africa, but also Life with IID and the many others that have joined us to say, let's create this space and platform. I would really like to thank you all. And from us to you, we continue that we'll stay on this conversation moving forward. Thank you very much. And until the next one. Okay, so that's that. We would be coming back later. We'll have your emails and we'll share the proceedings and then the outcomes that will also shape the next discussion. Thank you so much. And we'll monitor your contributions to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sal,
And
and
thanks to the
thank you, Mr.
moderator.
Chair.
Well, thank you for the good moderation. That was very good also. And Beatrice.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah.
Sal.